I'm Emily Carter, 32 years old, soldier, daughter, the one they never chose to see. At every Carter gathering, my father, Richard, lifts Daniel on a pedestal while I'm left in the shadows. My brother is the heir, the legacy, the golden son. I am the soldier daughter, the one they joke about when the wine flows. The night of his promotion dinner, their laughter cut sharper than the silverware. Daniel raised a glass, smirked, and told me maybe he'd find me a desk job. My father chuckled. My mother nodded. And every relative at that table looked at me as if my uniform was a costume, not a career. Ever been erased in the very room you bled to belong to? Hit like if you've ever been called useless. Comment if you've ever been pushed aside while someone else stole the spotlight. Because for me, it all started that night at the Carter family dinner, when their laughter wasn't just cruelty. It was the spark that lit everything that came next. Their insults tonight dragged me back to the day I first wore the uniform. The laughter at the dinner table still echoed faintly in my ears, but my mind was no longer in that gilded hall. I was 17 again, standing in the crisp autumn air at the U.S. Air Force Academy courtyard, the flag snapping overhead, the sharp smell of freshly cut grass mixing with jet fuel from the nearby base. The memory came uninvited, but it had been burned too deeply into me ever to fade. The chandeliers overhead cast their light like 1,000 accusing eyes, illuminating the polished oak table that stretched nearly the length of the hall. I sat midway down, positioned deliberately, I suspected, so I would not appear at the head beside my father, or too close to Daniel, the son whose shadow seemed endless. Their laughter mingled with the clinking of crystal glasses, filling the hall with a noise that felt less like warmth and more like mockery disguised in celebration. I had heard this tone before. Richard, my father, once told me, "The military is for those who fail." He had spoken it with a casual smirk years ago, in front of others, as if it were nothing more than a harmless jab. That echo reverberated tonight, stitched into every grin he flashed at Daniel, every nod of approval he offered, as if my brother were the only Carter who mattered. My fork traced the edge of my plate as I reminded myself that silence was not surrender, even if they thought it so. The goal of this dinner was clear. Richard wanted to cement Daniel as the Carter legacy. His promotion at Anderson Global had become the evening's anthem. With each toast raised in his honor, I sank deeper into my seat, listening to words meant to polish him and diminish me. The entire family gathered, uncles, cousins, and especially Margaret, my mother, who sat at Richard's side like a queen endorsing her heir. Every glance toward me was tinged with disbelief, as though they couldn't fathom why I had chosen a uniform over a briefcase. The dining hall itself seemed to conspire against me. High ceilings, oil paintings of Carter ancestors glaring down, shelves of vintage wine, every detail screamed legacy, tradition, and corporate dominance. It was Saturday night, the 18th of November, 2023, yet the setting felt timeless, a theater for humiliation that had been rehearsed for generations. I looked at the golden plates, the sparkling silverware, the crystal goblets, symbols of wealth and authority that were never meant for me. Around me, the players assembled. Richard, patriarch and judge, raising his glass to Daniel as though knighting him. Margaret, eyes cool, lips pressed in approval at every mention of her son's rise. Daniel, glowing, confident, drunk not only on wine, but on validation. Patricia leaned close to Robert, whispering with a smile that carried pity for me. Emma, always eager to join the chorus, chuckled at Daniel's quips. And me, Emily Carter, the soldier daughter, relegated to the margins, the useless one. The progression of the night followed a script I could recite with bitter ease. First came the toast. Richard stood, his voice commanding. To Daniel, the future of this family, the Carter name carried forward at Anderson Global. Glasses lifted, and the room erupted with cheers. Then the relatives, emboldened by wine, turned their sights on me. Patricia leaned across the table with mock sweetness. Still playing soldier, Emily? When will you settle into something real? Emma snickered. Robert added, she probably enjoys the marching, it saves her from thinking too much. Each jab landed, dressed in laughter, but piercing all the same. Daniel was not content to let them speak for him. He raised his glass again, smirking at me with that deliberate cruelty I had known since childhood. Maybe I'll get you a desk job, Emily. Something to keep you busy. Paperwork suits people who like to follow orders. The laughter that followed was deafening. I clenched my jaw, the words forming in my head sharper than any blade I had carried in uniform. They wanted me diminished, boxed into irrelevance. The moment sharpened when Daniel leaned back, smiling with feigned generosity. At least you're good at something small. The phrase hung in the air, dripping with condescension, heavier than the chandeliers themselves. My father chuckled, approving, as if Daniel's cruelty were wit. My mother nodded slightly, her silence complicit. Every eye at the table turned toward me, waiting for a reaction perhaps for me to lower my gaze, to absorb their laughter as I always had. But inside me, something else stirred. Their laughter no longer cut, it ignited. Beneath my stillness, beneath my forced calm, a vow crystallized. My pulse steadied, my breath slowed, and I felt a clarity I had not felt in years. Let them laugh tonight. Let them carve their mockery into my skin. Tomorrow, everything would begin to shift. Tomorrow, they would see. Let them laugh. Tomorrow, they'll choke on silence. Their insults tonight dragged me back to the day I first wore the uniform. The laughter at the dinner table still echoed faintly in my ears, but my mind was no longer in that gilded hall. I was 17 again, standing in the crisp autumn air at the U.S. Air Force Academy courtyard, the flag snapping overhead, the sharp smell of freshly cut grass mixing with jet fuel from the nearby base. The memory came uninvited, but it had been burned too deeply into me ever to fade. I could see Richard clearly, my father in his tailored suit, hands clasped behind his back, the cold expression in his eyes unmistakable. He didn't raise his voice that day. He didn't need to. His words carried the weight of judgment, as permanent as stone. "You're wasting potential," he said, the phrase delivered like a verdict. He never believed in service, never believed in sacrifice unless it could be measured in corporate profits and public accolades. To him, the academy wasn't a beginning, it was a detour into failure. Daniel was there too, only a few years older, already assuming his role as heir to everything Richard valued. He smirked in that same effortless way that would later charm boardrooms. "Girls don't belong in combat," he jeered, loud enough for the other cadets and families nearby to hear. "Try not to trip over your boots." Margaret stood beside them, lips pressed tightly together, her silence an endorsement of their disdain. She adjusted her pearl necklace, turned her face slightly, as though ashamed to be seen connected to me. I had wanted to crumble under their scorn that morning. My duffel bag felt twice as heavy, my hands trembled around the strap. But something inside me hardened. Their rejection, their lack of faith, was fuel. I marched through the courtyard gates without looking back, spine straight, steps firm, the echo of my boots slapping against the pavement in rhythm with my vow. I will prove them wrong. The academy was no sanctuary. It was a crucible. The first weeks broke many sleepless nights, relentless drills, endless rules meant to strip us down to nothing before building us back. I remembered the first time I folded my uniform shirt, trembling, terrified of getting a single crease wrong. I remembered running until my lungs burned, my legs gave out, and the sergeant's voice barked that failure wasn't an option. Each insult from my family echoed as I pushed through, their disbelief a constant whip across my back. Every time I stumbled, I heard Daniel's mocking tone. Every time I wanted to quit, I remembered Richard's eyes cold, dismissive. The moment that sealed it came months later, during my first military parade. The courtyard was transformed rows of cadets in flawless formation, brass instruments gleaming under the sun, the flag rippling like fire in the sky. I stood there in my crisp uniform, boots polished so perfectly I could see my reflection. Sweat collected under my collar, but I held still, shoulders square, chin high. My pulse thundered as we began the march, every step an act of defiance. They were there, Richard, Margaret, Daniel. I caught them in the crowd, their expressions unchanged. Richard's jaw was set, Margaret's lips tight, Daniel's smirk mocking even in silence. They watched, but they didn't see me. Not the way I wanted, not the way I needed. Still, I marched. Every step was a blade carving away their scorn, replacing it with my resolve. I belonged here, even if they would never admit it. I had thought, foolishly, that standing in that uniform might finally make them proud, that perhaps they would clap or nod, or even just offer a glance that wasn't dripping with disappointment. Instead, their disdain remained fixed, unyielding. The parade ended, the cadets dispersed, and I returned to my barracks with my chest aching, not from exhaustion, but from the hollowness of that hope. It was in that hollowness that I built the foundation of who I would become. 10 years later, at the Carter dinner table, their laughter pulled that memory back to the surface. The faces, the words, The feeling of invisibility, it all returned. But something had changed. I was no longer that trembling girl with the heavy duffel. I was the woman who had endured, who had risen, who had carved herself into steel with every insult, every jeer, every moment of disregard. My wineglass trembled slightly as I held it, not from weakness, but from the surge of determination swelling through me. They thought I was still the same Emily they had dismissed a decade ago. They believed my silence meant surrender. But they never saw me then, not truly. They only saw the daughter they wished I had not been, the sister they could mock without consequence. They won't see me coming now. My father's throne wasn't in our home, it was behind a corporate boardroom table. That morning, November 20th, Anderson Global's headquarters gleamed like a cathedral to power. Glass walls catching the gray Manhattan sky, the company's name etched in steel above the revolving doors. Inside, the air was hushed with money and ambition, the scent of polished wood and strong coffee mixing with the faint ozone of humming projectors. This was Richard Carter's true kingdom, not the family mansion, and today he wore his crown in the form of a tailored navy suit and a gaze that demanded obedience. The executives filed into the conference room like courtiers answering a summons. The long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, a fortress of wealth and privilege. On the wall hung a projection of Anderson Global's latest conquest, a cyber defense contract worth billions, signed with the Department of Defense only days earlier. Richard stood at the head, one hand resting on the table, the other raised in a commanding gesture. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low but resonant, "Anderson Global has secured the future of national security. With this deal, we are untouchable." Applause rippled around the table, rehearsed and reverent. Daniel sat at his right, a junior vice president by title but already a prince in practice. He leaned back, smirking with the same easy arrogance he had carried since childhood. His cufflinks flashed as he gestured toward the screen. "This deal secures my future," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My father built the foundation, but I will take Anderson Global into the next era." His words dripped with entitlement, as though legacy were simply another asset transferred on paper. The executives nodded, some eager, some wary. Richard's laugh cut through the room, smooth and confident. "No one can stop us," he said, dismissing every potential obstacle as if swatting away a fly. "The government needs us more than we need them. We are Anderson Global when we say the future. It becomes the future." His gaze swept over the table, daring anyone to contradict him. None did. But power, like glass, always shows hairline cracks first. Near the far end of the table, an older executive leaned toward a colleague and whispered, though not quietly enough, "Word is, the DoD is sending someone to review compliance. They're not entirely satisfied with the contract terms." The words carried a faint tremor, like smoke slipping into a sealed room. Richard's head turned, slow and deliberate, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the air in the room thickened. Then he scoffed, waving a hand with theatrical disdain. "Paperwork! Bureaucrats love their red tape. Nothing that can touch us." His voice rose with finality, stamping authority over doubt. The executives laughed nervously, relieved to mirror his confidence, but the unease lingered beneath their polished smiles. The meeting closed with a toast of confidence, Richard raising his glass of mineral water while Daniel basked in the glow of his father's empire. They believed themselves untouchable, heirs of a dynasty that stretched from mansion halls to government vaults. But outside that gleaming fortress of glass and ambition, in the quiet isolation of a high-rise penthouse, another story was already unfolding. Emily sat alone in the half-light of evening, the city sprawling beneath her like a restless ocean of neon. The laughter from 2 nights ago still gnawed at her ribs, but her eyes were fixed on the folder spread open across her desk. The seal at the top read classified, its red stamp stark against the white paper. She traced her fingers over the first page, absorbing every word, every detail of Anderson Global's vulnerabilities. Her lips curved into something between sorrow and steel. Richard had dismissed the whisper as paperwork. Daniel had called it his future. Neither of them knew that the paperwork had a name. Neither of them knew it was her. Let them keep laughing, she thought. They would not laugh much longer. On my laptop screen glowed the secret that could dismantle my father's empire. The cursor blinked against classified headers, each line of text pulling me deeper into a world only a handful of people in the country were authorized to touch. Cyber vulnerabilities, procurement fraud, inconsistencies in Anderson Global's reporting. Every page was a blade honed by truth, and I alone had been trusted to wield it. The silence of my penthouse office pressed close around me. The city lights beyond the windows glittered like a field of fire, but inside, the glow of the screen burned hotter than any skyline. Daniel's voice echoed unbidden in my mind, taunting from that dinner table just 2 nights earlier. Maybe you'll work for me someday. He had smirked then, basking in his promotion, in the weight of our father's hand on his shoulder. I tightened my jaw. If only he knew that while he measured power in titles and contracts, mine was measured in access codes and evidence stamped with the seal of the United States government. The report laid it bare. Anderson Global had overbilled on multiple defense contracts, padded cybersecurity audits, and ignored flagged vulnerabilities that could have endangered national systems. They had signed their names to compliance documents riddled with deceit. I scrolled through pages of encrypted logs, whistleblower testimony, and satellite audit trails. Every keystroke seemed louder than it should be, as if the empire itself could hear me breathing. The secure phone on my desk buzzed, startling me. Its red indicator flashed. Only one man had that line. I pressed accept, the screen lighting with the face of General Jonathan Reed. His presence carried authority, even through the grainy secure feed, the kind of authority my father could never purchase with money or power. Captain Carter, Reed's gravelly voice filled the room. You've reviewed the report? Yes, sir, I said, straightening instinctively. It's damning. Enough to bring down the entire division if it goes public. My throat tightened. Sir, they'll be there. My family. My father. My brother. If I'm the one standing at that podium, you'll be the one to present. Reed cut in, unflinching. His eyes bore into mine as though reading the doubt I tried to mask. You've carried the uniform for a decade. You've earned this. Tomorrow is not about them. Tomorrow is about the country. My hand curled into a fist on the desk. The words should have steeled me, but the image of Richard's scorn, Daniel's laughter, Margaret's dismissive sigh, they tangled around my resolve like barbed wire. They'll see me as nothing but... Enough. Reed's tone cracked like a whip. Tomorrow, you're not their daughter. You're the U.S. Air Force. Understand that. The finality of his words silenced the doubts clattering in my chest. For a moment, I imagined him standing beside me, his uniform heavy with medals, the weight of history at his back. A man who had fought wars both seen and unseen was telling me I was strong enough to fight this one. The call ended with a brief nod. The secure line went dark, leaving only the low hum of the city beyond my windows. I stared at the laptop again, at the damning truths glowing on the screen. For the first time, the data didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a weapon. Slowly, I rose and crossed the room. The wardrobe loomed against the wall, its mirrored doors reflecting my tense figure. I opened it, and there, hanging pristine, was the uniform that had carried me through years of sweat, doubt, and sacrifice. The medals, polished and understated, caught the dim light. I touched the fabric with trembling fingers, feeling its weight even before I put it on. The laughter of my family, their jeers and dismissals, still rang faint in my ears. Yet standing there, with the uniform before me, and Reed's words echoing in my chest, the fear shifted into something sharper. Then let them see who's useless. Some knives don't glint, they spread like whispers. In the polished corridors of Anderson Global, those whispers traveled faster than footsteps, slipping between glass walls and closed office doors. I walked them now, the echo of my heels sharp against marble. And even before I heard the words, I felt the atmosphere bend. Eyes lingered on me a fraction too long, and then slid away, lips twitching, as if holding secrets they couldn't wait to share. Daniel's smirk from that family dinner had never really left me. It was etched into his face now, as he leaned casually against the doorway of a conference room, tie loosened, posture too relaxed for a man supposedly carrying the Carter legacy. Around him clustered a half-dozen junior executives, eager acolytes soaking in his every word. His voice carried just far enough to reach me. "She's just a paper officer," Daniel drawled. 10 years in uniform, and what does she have to show? Reports, files, maybe a desk medal or two. The Air Force keeps her around for decoration, like those flags in the lobby. A ripple of laughter followed, the kind that grows louder when cruelty finds a willing audience. My hands clenched at my sides, but I didn't break stride. To stop, to confront him here, would only feed his performance. Instead, I let the words hang, let them coil inside me like smoke seeking air. But whispers spread, and smoke suffocates. By the end of the week, the echoes of Daniel's disdain had woven themselves into the very fabric of the building. Junior staff snickered when I passed. Murmurs of paper officer drifting like poison through air ducts. Even the secretaries looked at me differently, as though measuring me against a rumor they were eager to believe. Then came the memo. It appeared in my inbox like a snake slipped under the door. An internal notice, stamped and signed at least at first glance, bearing the Defense Department's insignia. It claimed that Captain Emily Carter had exaggerated her operational experience, inflated her rank, and used confidential access for personal advancement. The language was damning, formal, heavy with the kind of bureaucratic phrasing that suffocates careers in silence. I read it once, twice, my pulse hammering against my ribs. It was a forgery, I knew that immediately. The dates didn't match. The phrasing was just off enough, and yet it was slick, convincing enough that anyone outside the chain of command would accept it as gospel. My throat tightened as I scrolled to the end of the message. The distribution list included Anderson executives. Daniel hadn't just whispered this time. He'd written it in ink. By late afternoon, the official notice arrived. Pending investigation, Captain Emily Carter's right to present findings at the Defense Oversight Committee is suspended. I sat alone in my penthouse, the city lights beginning to prickle against the dusk outside, the words glowing coldly from my laptop screen. Suspended. It was the corporate equivalent of shackles, a gag tightened over my mouth just as I prepared to speak. My hands hovered above the keys, useless in the face of a wall I couldn't simply type through. And yet, something in me shifted. I leaned back, a laugh escaping quiet, sharp, almost bitter. It wasn't humor. It was recognition. Daniel thought he had cornered me. He thought whispers were enough to unravel 10 years of discipline, sacrifice, and service. He thought he could play on his battlefield Anderson Global's corridors, the smirks of executives, the poison of rumor. But this wasn't his battlefield. It was mine. The uniform still hung ready in my closet. The classified files still burned bright on my laptop. The truth was heavier than any rumor he could conjure. And I still carried the one weapon Daniel had never understood: patience forged by years of being underestimated. I closed the laptop, the reflection of my face dark against the screen. The whispers might have spread, but the silence before a strike is always the most dangerous. If Daniel wants war, he'll get it on my battlefield. Rumors are like smoke, they seep through cracks and choke the air. By the time I reached Anderson Global's upper floor on Tuesday morning, that smoke had already curled thick around the boardroom. The glass walls could not contain it. Whispers clung to every surface, infecting the polished mahogany table where the company's future was decided. Richard Carter sat at the head, his posture imperial, chin lifted as though carved from stone. His reputation in the defense sector was a throne, one he had built contract by contract, and today's meeting should have been his coronation. Final approval on a cyber defense deal that would cement Anderson Global as indispensable to the Department of Defense. Yet instead of confidence, tension swirled among the executives, fingers tapping pens, eyes darting across printed dossiers. Colonel Carter, one of the directors began, voice low but clear enough to cut the silence, is under investigation. That's the latest from Defense. He slid a thin folder across the table. Richard's jaw flexed as he opened it, scanning the memo that I knew too well, the same forged document Daniel had conjured like a knife in the dark. His lips thinned, unreadable, but his knuckles whitened against the edge of the paper. Across from him, Daniel leaned back in his chair with a carefully measured expression of surprise, hands steepled as if to steady himself against the weight of the news. "It's what I've heard from DoD circles as well," he said smoothly. "I didn't want to bring it up until I had confirmation." His eyes flicked to his father, feigning reluctance while feeding fuel to the fire. A murmur swept the table. Executives exchanged glances, suspicion growing like a storm front. One of them, a woman with sharp glasses and sharper instincts, cleared her throat. "If she's suspended, the optics are terrible. Presenting sensitive information through a compromised officer could put this entire deal at risk. The Pentagon won't like it." Another chimed in, "Perhaps we should delay finalizing the contract until the matter clears." Delay. That single word rippled outward, subtle but dangerous. A deal delayed was a deal endangered. In the defense industry, hesitation smelled like weakness, and competitors were wolves waiting for blood. Richard closed the folder slowly, laying it flat before him. His gaze traveled down the length of the table, assessing each of his lieutenants in silence. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, heavy, deliberate. "If she's suspended," he said, voice low with steel, "then she won't be in that room tomorrow. We'll handle the presentation ourselves. Daniel, you'll stand beside me." The Carter name will not falter. The room relaxed at his decree, the executives nodding in practiced unison. The throne had spoken. Yet under the table, Daniel's phone vibrated. He slid it out with practiced ease, thumbs moving quickly as his mask of solemnity never faltered. Stage set. She's out. He hit send, the corners of his mouth twitching at the edges. Smoke curled higher, and I, unseen, uninvited, could feel it choking, wrapping tighter around the boardroom like a noose. Betrayal poisons, but sometimes truths whisper back. By Tuesday night, the corridors of the Military Cyber Command Center pulsed with fluorescent light and the low hum of servers, a sterile rhythm that matched the pounding of my own frustration. I sat stiff-backed across from General Reed in his glass-walled office, the city glowing faintly beyond, my uniform collar feeling more like a noose than a badge of honor. "They've cut my voice out," I said, my fist tight on the desk. "Suspended me like I'm some liability. Daniel's poison worked, and now the boardroom belongs to him." Reed studied me with his measured calm, the kind that belonged to a man who had weathered decades of storms. His silver hair caught the glare of the overhead lights, his eyes steady, unblinking. "You think I don't know sabotage when I see it? That memo stinks of fabrication. But knowing and proving are different battles, Captain." The frustration in me burned hotter, clawing for release. I opened my mouth to argue, but the faintest sound interrupted a shuffle at the door. A young engineer hovered there, shoulders tense, badge swinging nervously on his lanyard. His nameplate read Miller, E. He looked barely 30, his frame wiry, his glasses slightly crooked. He cleared his throat. "General, Captain Carter, I think I can help." Reed's brows drew together. "Ethan, you're off shift. What are you doing here?" The young man stepped in, shutting the door behind him. His fingers tightened around a small flash drive like it was a live grenade. "Sir, ma'am? He swallowed. "I work systems audits. And I tracked the metadata trail from that memo. The timestamps don't align with DoD servers. They align with Anderson Global's internal network, specifically Daniel Carter's workstation." My breath froze. Ethan's words cut clean through the fog of rumor and suspicion, replacing them with something harder: proof. Reed leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're saying Daniel fabricated the memo from inside his company?" Ethan nodded, throat bobbing. "Yes, sir. I've cross-referenced every log, every digital fingerprint. It's airtight. But if I turn this over, if I even admit I accessed this without clearance, I'm finished. My career over." For a moment, silence pressed between us, heavy and suffocating. Reed's jaw clenched. "You realize what this means, Captain? Using Ethan's evidence is stepping onto a minefield. One misstep, and it doesn't just end his career, it could blow up yours. You'll both be branded as reckless, insubordinate." The weight of his warning pressed hard against me, but the anger inside me surged higher, sharper. I looked at Ethan, his hands trembling around that flash drive, and then at Reed, his caution forged from decades of battles lost and won. My voice steadied as I leaned forward. "Then we risk it. Silence is no longer an option." Reed's lips pressed into a line, but he didn't argue. His eyes softened, just barely, with the flicker of something like approval. Ethan exhaled shakily, as though bracing for impact, and extended the flash drive toward me. The plastic glinted under the sterile lights, more lethal than any blade. "This," he whispered, his voice rough with fear and resolve, "will burn him. Family smiles can cut sharper than any enemy's blade." That truth carved itself into me as I crept through the dimly lit hallway of the Carter mansion, the glow of antique sconces painting the walls in gold that felt more like rust. It was late, close to midnight on November 21st, and yet the voices carried from the drawing room with enough venom to keep me wide awake. Richard's baritone, always the voice of command, thundered through the crack of the door. "We'll make sure she never enters that boardroom. Not tomorrow. Not ever." My breath stilled. He spoke my erasure as casually as he once praised Daniel's smallest accomplishments. Inside, Margaret's voice trembled, soft but edged with desperation. "She's still your daughter, Richard. She's given her life to the uniform, to this country. Doesn't that count for—" The sound of his hand slamming the armrest cut her short. "Don't you dare defend her," he snapped. "She betrayed this family the moment she chose the military over us. Over the Carter legacy." His tone made the word legacy sound like scripture, an altar at which he demanded sacrifice. Daniel chuckled low, the kind of smirk made audible. "Relax, father. Leave it to me. She'll be nothing but a footnote by the time this deal is sealed." Through the crack, I could see his smile, sharp, smug, the same expression he wore when mocking me across the dinner table. Richard's approving nod sealed their pact, a coronation by candlelight. Margaret's shoulders sagged, her voice barely a breath. "You'll destroy her." Richard leaned closer to her, his face half-shadowed but no less fierce. "Number, she destroyed herself. I'm only protecting what's mine." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the clink of crystal as Daniel poured himself a drink. Their laughter soon joined it, smooth and poisonous, the sound of blades being sharpened under the guise of civility. In the shadows of the hallway, I pressed my palm against the cold wallpaper, every muscle in me vibrating not with fear, but with clarity. They thought their plotting was a weapon. To me, it was evidence, another chain link in the rope they were tightening around their own necks. "Perfect," I whispered into the darkness, my lips curling into a smile they would never see. "Keep digging your own grave. Power can vanish with a single stamped letter." The envelope was thin, its government seal embossed in unforgiving black, but when I slid it open, the paper inside carried the weight of a hammer. Suspension, effective immediately. Pending completion of investigation. The words blurred for a moment as though my own pulse had shaken the page. The Pentagon side office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and stale carpet. The kind of place where decisions that could end careers were written in sterile ink. I sat stiffly across from the military legal officer, her voice monotone as she confirmed the order. "Colonel Carter, until further review, you are barred from presenting tomorrow." Her gaze didn't rise to meet mine. Reed's fist slammed the table before I could respond. The sudden force rattled the pens in their holder, a small rebellion against the bureaucracy smothering us. "This reeks of manipulation," he growled, his silver brows knit together. "I've seen shameless politics, but this? To silence her days before the contract vote? It stinks of corporate interference." I wanted to argue, to spit back fire, but my throat felt like glass. All the nights, the training, the uniform I wore with pride, reduced to a line of cold text. My voice cracked. "After all this, they've won?" The words tasted of ash, heavy with the same humiliation I'd endured at the dinner table. Except now, the humiliation carried the seal of my own government. Reed turned to me sharply, eyes blazing. "Number, they've only delayed you, and delay isn't defeat." But even his conviction couldn't banish the hollow pit in my chest. My hands shook against the suspension letter, a tangible symbol of every sneer Richard and Daniel had thrown my way. They had orchestrated this. I knew it. Somewhere in Anderson Global's corridors, Daniel was probably smiling, convinced he had finally erased me. The door burst open, cutting through the suffocating air. Ethan stumbled inside, breathless, clutching a folder so tightly the edges were bent. His eyes darted between us, determination burning beneath his nerves. "I have it," he said, voice trembling but strong. The chain of emails proving Daniel forged the memo. Every step, every edit, his fingerprints are all over it. I shot to my feet, disbelief and hope warring inside me. "You're certain?" He nodded quickly, setting the folder on the table with reverence. I traced the metadata from Anderson Global's servers. The timestamps match his logins. It's airtight. He can't deny this. For a heartbeat, silence hung. Then Reed's hand came down like a gavel, slamming the desk so hard the coffee cup toppled. His voice thundered with a force that filled the tiny office. "Then we reinstate her today." Marble floors reflected their confidence. They didn't see the storm walking in. Anderson Global's lobby gleamed like a cathedral to power, white stone polished so bright it mirrored every step. Executives in tailored suits streamed past, their laughter clipped and assured. The smell of imported leather and cologne hung in the air, blending with the faint click of heels and the rustle of silk ties. At the heart of it all, Richard Carter stood like a monarch surveying his court. His hand rested on Daniel's shoulder, pride radiating through every boastful word he offered to the cluster of board members gathered near the grand staircase. "Today, gentlemen, we finalize the contract," he declared. "A legacy-defining partnership. Anderson Global will stand as the cornerstone of America's defense for decades to come." Daniel leaned in, his voice lower but no less smug, eyes glancing toward the glass entrance doors. "And Emily? She won't be here. The investigation buried her. Consider her neutralized." The executives chuckled in agreement, heads nodding, their trust in Daniel as seamless as the marble beneath their shoes. I watched from just outside, the reflection of my uniform cutting through the glass like a blade poised to strike. The weight of the Air Force blues pressed heavy but proud against my shoulders. Every ribbon, every insignia stitched into the fabric carried the story they had tried to erase. Behind me, General Reed's steady presence anchored the moment. His silence was not hesitation, but timing, the kind of silence that preceded thunder. The security guard at the front desk stiffened, confusion flashing across his face as I stepped forward. "Colonel Carter?" he stammered. He glanced at his clipboard as though it might erase me. Daniel's rumors, the forged memo, the suspension letter, they all echoed in his hesitation. But Reed's voice cut through, sharp as a command drill. "The Department of Defense representative has arrived." Heads turned instantly. Richard's smirk faltered. Daniel's glass of champagne froze halfway to his lips. Executives craned their necks, whispers darting across the marble like quicksilver. The guard stepped aside reluctantly, and the massive boardroom doors swung open with a solemn weight. I entered, each footstep deliberate, each echo across the polished floor stripping the confidence from their laughter. Gasps rippled around the table, the sound of certainty fracturing. The storm had arrived. Every eye in the boardroom turned when I walked in the ghost they called useless. The room itself was a shrine to control. Long mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Washington skyline, a chandelier dripping with cold light above polished suits. The men and women around the table shifted in their chairs as the echo of my boots carried across the marble, cutting the silence into neat, jagged pieces. Richard had been mid-sentence, his voice booming with rehearsed pride. "The Carter name has always stood for strength, loyalty, legacy." He stopped. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch from across the room. Daniel's smirk wilted, his hand tightening around the leather armrest. He looked as though he'd seen a ghost. And in a way, he had the daughter and sister they'd mocked into shadows now stepped forward with brass on her chest that gleamed brighter than their corporate ambitions. Reed didn't allow the silence to stretch long. His voice filled the air with the authority of a war drum. "Gentlemen and ladies, meet the lead officer for this review." He gestured toward me, his hand steady, deliberate. "Colonel Emily Carter." The title cracked against the polished walls like a gunshot. The hush that followed was suffocating, broken only by the soft clink of a pen dropped by a board member too stunned to hold it. I moved forward, shoulders squared, metals glinting under the chandelier's cold fire. Each step erased a decade of their derision. Each ribbon on my uniform contradicted every sneer, every whispered insult, every laugh at dinner tables where I'd been served mockery instead of bread. Richard's color drained slowly, like sand falling through an hourglass. His hands gripped the table's edge until his knuckles whitened, but he said nothing. His empire, his throne, was suddenly unsteady. Daniel's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The arrogant air had been stripped of his script. The board members leaned forward, some frowning, others blinking in disbelief. Whispers darted along the table like sparks seeking kindling. The Carter legacy wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Richard. It was the soldier standing in front of them, the daughter they had dismissed. The weight of silence pressed on my chest, but I welcomed it. For once, their laughter was gone. For once, they had nothing. At the far end of the table, Chairman Hamilton, a man of silver hair and measured words, leaned closer. His eyes scanned my uniform, then rose to my face, wide with recognition. His whisper sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "Colonel Carter?" The Carter men gaped, their empire collapsing not with a shout, but with a single name spoken in awe. My father's empire cracked the instant I laid my rank on the table. The silence from my entrance had barely settled when Richard's voice surged forward like a desperate tide trying to cover a breach. He rose from his chair, puffing his chest, his tie trembling slightly, as if even the silk knew his hands were unsteady. "She's here as family, nothing more," he scoffed, his tone dripping with the same disdain I'd heard since childhood. The board should not confuse dinner table titles with boardroom credentials. Daniel leapt into the opening, his smirk sharpened into venom. "She inflates her rank," he sneered, his voice pitched just high enough to reach every ear at the table. "Don't be dazzled by a few medals. Emily always wanted more credit than she deserved." His gaze locked on mine, daring me to falter under the weight of his lies. The room buzzed with whispers, cautious, skeptical, some curious, others already leaning toward doubt. Pride had long trained me to swallow their words, but tonight pride wasn't my chain, it was my weapon. Reed slammed his palm against the polished wood, his voice a strike of thunder. "Enough!" his eyes cut like steel as they swept across the room, pinning Richard and Daniel in their seats. "She outranks every single person in this room. And unless I've forgotten the Constitution, the Department of Defense does not answer to boardroom gossip." The weight of his authority crushed their murmurs, but Richard still clung to the fantasy of control. "This is manipulation," he barked. "She's exploiting her family ties to insert herself into Carter business. It's disgraceful." I felt the burn rise in my chest, not of shame but of fury honed sharp by years of dismissal. My hands shook not from fear, but from the sheer restraint of holding back for so long. No more. I stepped forward, my boots striking the floor like a drum roll to their undoing. With deliberate calm, I reached into my jacket and withdrew the badge that carried the truth they could not twist. The laminate glinted, the eagle seal crisp in the boardroom light. "Colonel Emily Carter," I said, my voice steady, loud enough to leave no room for doubt. Then, with a crack against the wood that echoed through every corner of the room, I slammed the ID card onto the table. "Lead of U.S. Cyber Defense." The impact was more than sound. It was the shattering of their narrative, the breaking of their fortress of lies. Richard's face stiffened, his mouth twitching with words that refused to form. Daniel leaned back, his smirk collapsing into the pale mask of someone cornered, caught, stripped. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the whispers began again, softer this time, not mocking but astonished. "If she holds the contract," one board member murmured, awe threading through disbelief, "everything changes." Another finished, eyes widening as the realization spread like fire across the table. And there it was, their empire trembling on foundations that were no longer theirs. Truth doesn't whisper, it detonates. The hum of the projector filled the boardroom as I connected the encrypted drive. A cold blue glow spread across the polished walls, throwing fractured light onto the anxious faces of men and women who had walked into this room expecting a coronation, not an execution. The first slide flared into existence, a digital map riddled with red cracks like arteries bleeding out across the screen. Anderson Global's cyber defense systems, the so-called impenetrable walls of my father's empire, lay bare with vulnerabilities pulsing for all to see. Gasps broke the air, sharp and involuntary. Executives leaned forward, their knuckles white against the table. Whispers tumbled between them terms like catastrophic, breach, liability. Each word was a nail driving deeper into the coffin of the Carter name they had revered. I moved through the slides, each one a grenade. Hacked firewalls, unpatched backdoors, dormant malware capable of hollowing out entire systems. The truth was no longer abstract. It glared at them in colors no corporate spin could dim. Richard shot up from his chair, his face blotched crimson. "You can't shame this company," he bellowed, slamming his fist onto the table. "This display means nothing. You twist numbers, exaggerate risks. This is my legacy, my blood." His voice cracked, a fissure of panic splitting through rage. Daniel tried to rally beside him, his voice slick but trembling at the edges. "She's manipulating classified data. She's always wanted to tear this family apart. Look at her parading in uniform just to destroy us." The board members didn't look at me as a traitor. They looked at me as the shield they'd never known they needed. And worse for my father, they looked at him as the sword that had failed them. I stepped closer to the table, each word hammered with conviction. "It's not about shame," I said, letting my gaze pierce through the defenses Richard tried to hold up. "It's about national security, and you failed." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Executives shifted in their seats, shoulders sagging under the weight of betrayal. The Carter name, once untouchable, now flickered with the stench of liability. And then, from the corner of my eye, I caught the frantic movement. Daniel hunched over his laptop, fingers stabbing at the keys with desperation, sweat streaking his temples. His voice hissed under his breath, sharp and panicked, yet audible enough to freeze the room. "Erase side files now before she shows more." The glow of the projector bathed his face, exposing not confidence but the terror of a man cornered by truth. The boardroom, already charged with shock, tilted sharply toward chaos. The storm had arrived, and Daniel's fear was the spark that would set it ablaze. The moment his boss bowed, the Carter world flipped upside down. The projector dimmed to black, leaving only the faint glow of laptop screens and the sound of shallow, uneven breathing. No one moved at first. The weight of revelation clung to the boardroom like smoke. Then, slowly, Chairman Hamilton, gray-haired, steady, A man who had never before been seen bending to anyone pushed his chair back and stood. His gaze swept the room, lingering a heartbeat on Richard, then Daniel, before turning squarely to me. He walked around the long table with deliberate steps, polished shoes clicking against marble like a judge's gavel. Every executive straightened, waiting for him to reclaim order with the old hierarchy. Richard smirked faintly, clinging to the hope that loyalty would shield him. But Hamilton stopped in front of me. His eyes held mine, unflinching. Then he bowed, just slightly, barely more than a dip of his head, but enough to tear the air out of the room. The sound of silence itself changed, as if the universe had shifted its balance. "Ma'am," Hamilton said, his voice firm and unembellished, "what are our options?" The words dropped like a thunderclap. For the first time in my life, Richard froze completely, robbed of even his anger. His lips parted, but nothing came. Daniel blinked hard, shaking his head as though he'd misheard, his composure dissolving into pure disbelief. The room turned to me, every pair of eyes, sharp and expectant. I let the pause stretch, savoring the crack in their fortress. Calmly, without rushing, I spoke. "The company will undergo a full security overhaul," I said, my tone measured, clinical. "Military oversight will ensure every vulnerability is eliminated. Contracts will be reviewed independently, free from Carter influence." My gaze swept toward Richard and Daniel, pinning them to their chairs. "And both of you will step aside, effective immediately." The silence that followed wasn't shock, it was assent. Heads nodded faintly around the table, shoulders eased as if a burden had been lifted. The Carter men were no longer their saviors, but their risk. Richard's face blanched, his knuckles white on the edge of the table. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened again only to be drowned by the sheer finality of the board's stillness. His power had evaporated in the space of a bow. And then Daniel exploded. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward, eyes wide with fury. His voice cracked the fragile silence like a whip. "You're destroying us!" he shouted, spit flecking the polished wood, his hand trembling over the table as though he might strike it. Or me, or both. But no one moved to stop me. No one rushed to defend him. The reversal was complete, and Daniel's rage was nothing more than noise against the weight of the bow that had changed everything. Sometimes justice isn't loud, it's the silence when the guilty are stripped of power. The boardroom, once Richard's kingdom, now smelled of stale sweat and fading dominance. Papers rustled, not with eagerness but with finality, as each board member raised a hand. One by one, the vote sealed itself into the record. Richard Carter, forced into early retirement, his jaw tightened, face carved into stone, but no protest came. Not a word. Silence devoured the man who had once thundered over every meeting, every dinner, every part of my life. Daniel fared no better. The forged memo, the trail of lies Ethan had unearthed, left him cornered. Anderson Global's legal team didn't need convincing. An internal investigation was announced on the spot. His protests rang shrill in the vast chamber, his denial growing thinner the longer he spoke. The executives who once toasted him now looked away, unwilling to tether their futures to his sinking name. For the first time, Daniel stood alone, and he knew it. Weeks passed, November's sharp winds giving way to December's icy calm. Washington dressed itself in wreaths and flags, but the air that day carried something heavier than festivity. The auditorium filled with uniforms, brass gleaming, medals heavy with history, military leaders, congressional figures, families all gathered under a dome of solemnity and pride. I stood at the center, the crisp fabric of my uniform pulling straight across my shoulders. The star pinned to my chest shimmered under the spotlight's Brigadier General. A title, yes, but more than that. Vindication, carved not by family name, but by every trial endured, every sneer swallowed, every fight fought in silence. General Reed stood beside me, steady and proud, his eyes reflecting the weight of both history and the moment. The applause faded as I turned to the podium. My voice carried steady, unwavering. "Sometimes, the path they tell you to avoid," I said, letting the silence stretch, "is the only one worth walking." A young officer in the front rows straightened, eyes wide, hope burning where doubt might once have lived. I let the words hang there, for her, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The ceremony closed, the anthem rising. Yet my eyes caught a figure in the back row, slouched low in the shadows. Richard. His shoulders hunched, his face lined not with age but with defeat. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He simply watched the empire gone, the legacy shattered, his daughter standing where he once swore she never would. My fingers brushed the star pinned to my chest, a whisper. too soft for anyone else to hear, left my lips. Justice, at last. The silence answered, and this time it was mine. The empire built on arrogance and deceit collapsed not with a roar, but with the quiet surrender of those who once believed themselves untouchable. Justice did not come swiftly. It came after years of scorn and silence, but when it arrived, it burned brighter than every mockery that tried to smother it. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime, reminding us that truth has a patience stronger than power. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you felt the same fire of justice, or 2 if you think it could have ended differently.